It was supposed to be another glittering royal evening, polished by diamonds, protocol, and forced smiles. But behind the candlelit elegance, one private laugh cut through the room like a blade. And when the Queen saw who it was aimed at, the monarchy's silence cracked. Before we go deeper into this royal moment, make sure to subscribe, because stories like this reveal the secrets the palace never wanted spoken aloud. Diana entered with the kind of grace that made people stop, even when they tried not to. Her dress was striking, bold enough to be noticed, but elegant enough to stay within the rules of royal life. It carried confidence, yet behind that confidence was a woman who knew the room was not kind. Every eye felt like a question. Every smile felt measured. Every whisper seemed to ask whether she still belonged inside the world that had once lifted her so high. She moved carefully, not because she was weak, but because she understood the danger of being watched. Diana had learned that in the royal circle, nothing was ever simple. A dress was not just a dress. A glance was not just a glance. A laugh could become a weapon if it landed in the right place at the wrong time. And that night, the weapon came from someone who knew exactly where to aim it. Camilla noticed Diana almost immediately. At first, it was only a look. Then came the small smile, the kind that tried to hide cruelty behind manners. A quiet remark passed to someone nearby. A tiny gesture, nothing loud enough to cause a scene, nothing clear enough for the public to accuse, but sharp enough for Diana to feel it. Diana caught the energy. She understood. Maybe she did not hear every word, but she did not need to. She had lived long enough in that palace world to know when laughter was not laughter, but judgment. Still, she did not turn. She did not answer. She did not let pain rise to her face. She chose dignity, because dignity was the only shield left when kindness was missing. But someone else had seen it too. From across the room, the Queen watched in silence. She saw Camilla's smirk. She saw the whisper. Most importantly, she saw Diana's stillness. And in that stillness, she saw something the others missed. A young woman being humiliated under the roof of the crown, while everyone else pretended not to notice. The evening carried on. Glasses were raised. Polite voices continued. The machine of monarchy kept moving, smooth and cold. But the Queen's expression changed. Only slightly. Just enough for those who knew her to feel the air shift. A line had been crossed. Because this was never only about fashion, it was about power. It was about who could mock, who had to endure, and who the palace would protect when cruelty dressed itself as charm. Camilla believed the moment was private. She believed the Queen's silence meant nothing. But the silence was not approval. It was calculation. But what Camilla failed to understand was that inside palace walls, the quietest witness often held the sharpest weapon. To the world, it was fabric, elegance, and royal glamour. To Diana, it was armor. To Camilla, it was a provocation. And to the Queen, it became a symbol of something far more dangerous than style, a woman refusing to disappear. Diana had not chosen that dress by accident. In the royal world, nothing was ever only beautiful. Every color carried meaning. Every jewel had history. Every neckline, every sleeve, every small detail could become a message. And Diana knew this better than anyone, because she had lived inside that silent language for years. She understood that people were not just looking at what she wore. They were looking for weakness. They were looking for fear. They were looking for proof that she had been pushed too far. But that night, Diana walked in wearing more than elegance. She wore a quiet answer. The dress became her way of saying she was still present, still strong, still impossible to ignore. It showed confidence, but it also carried pain. It was the kind of confidence that comes from someone who has been hurt again and again, yet still refuses to lower her head. Behind her calm smile was a woman who knew how lonely a crowded palace could feel. She could be surrounded by titles, jewels, and applause, and still feel completely alone. That was why Camilla's mockery landed so deeply. It was not just a joke about fabric. It was not just a careless whisper in a glittering room. It was a strike at Diana's courage. It was aimed at the one thing Diana had tried to protect, her right to stand tall. Camilla may have thought she was laughing at a dress, but the insult reached much further. It touched Diana's place in the family, her pride, her pain, and the quiet battle she fought every time she stepped into royal life. And still, Diana did not break. She could have turned. She could have answered. She could have allowed the pain to show. But she gave Camilla nothing. No tears, no trembling voice, no public wound. Her restraint became more powerful than any sharp reply, because it forced the room to sit inside its own cruelty. Diana's silence did not mean she felt nothing. It meant she had learned how to survive being watched. The Queen understood that, perhaps more than anyone expected. From where she stood, the Queen saw the deeper meaning. Mocking Diana's dress was mocking Diana herself. It was mocking the woman the world adored, the woman the palace struggled to control, and the woman whose suffering had become too visible to ignore. For years, the Queen had allowed tensions to sit behind closed doors. She had watched discomfort pass through the family like a cold draft. She had chosen patience, order, and silence. But this was different. This had happened under the royal roof, in front of the monarchy's own eyes. It was not private pain hidden behind palace doors. It was humiliation wrapped in manners, and the Queen saw it clearly. Diana may have looked graceful, but grace can hide deep loneliness. Camilla may have looked confident, but confidence can become carelessness. And in that single cruel moment, the Queen understood that if the palace did nothing, the silence itself would become a choice. Diana stood there, beautiful and wounded, refusing to disappear. Camilla believed she had won a small private victory. But the Queen had already begun to see the danger. This was no longer about a dress. It was about who had permission to hurt Diana, who had the power to look away, and whether the crown would protect dignity only when the public was watching. And while Diana chose silence in that moment, the Queen began making a decision no one in the room could yet see. The Queen did not shout. She did not interrupt the evening. She did not expose Camilla before the room. But those closest to the throne knew something had shifted. Because when the Queen's face went still, it often meant consequences were already forming. For most people in that room, the moment seemed small. A whisper, a laugh, a passing cruelty hidden under polite smiles. But inside the palace, small moments could carry heavy meaning. The Queen had ruled long enough to know that danger did not always arrive with raised voices. Sometimes it came softly, dressed in charm, moving through a room as if it had every right to be there. Her reaction was not dramatic. That made it more frightening. There was no sharp command. No sudden silence forced upon the guests. No public warning that would turn the evening into scandal. The Queen simply became still. Her eyes held the room with a quiet weight. And those who knew her understood that stillness was not empty. It was judgment. It was memory. It was the beginning of a decision. The Queen's power had never needed to be loud. She could change the meaning of an evening with one pause. She could reward loyalty with a glance and freeze ambition with silence. Her authority lived in timing, in distance, in who was invited closer and who was gently pushed away. That was why the people nearest to her began to feel the shift before anyone said a word. Conversations softened. Smiles became careful. A few eyes moved toward Diana, then quickly away. Palace insiders sensed that something had gone wrong beneath the surface. They did not know exactly what the queen would do, but they knew the room had changed. The laughter that had seemed harmless seconds before now carried a shadow. Camilla, however, did not see the danger. She believed the moment had passed. She believed her little remark had disappeared into the noise of royal conversation. To her, Diana had not reacted, so there was no wound to answer for. That was her mistake. In the palace, the deepest wounds were often the quiet ones, and the most serious punishments were born from what people thought no one had noticed. Diana sensed something too. Not comfort, not open kindness. The queen was not a woman who rushed forward with emotion. But there was recognition, and for Diana, that mattered. She had spent so much time feeling watched without being understood. Now, for one strange moment, it felt as if someone had seen not only the insult, but the strength it took not to answer it. Still, the queen's mind was not only on Diana's embarrassment. She was thinking of the crown. She was thinking of order, discipline, and the thin line between private cruelty and public damage. Diana was difficult for the institution to control. Yes, she stirred sympathy, emotion, and questions the palace did not always want asked. But humiliating her in front of royal eyes created another danger. It made the monarchy look cold. It made the family look careless. It made the palace seem willing to let pain become entertainment. And that was something the queen could not ignore. Her silence grew heavier, because it was not weakness. It was preparation. Behind that calm face, she was weighing people, loyalties, risks, and consequences. Camilla had mocked a dress, but the queen saw a challenge to hierarchy. Diana had stayed silent, but the queen saw a woman pushed to the edge and still standing. The room had pretended nothing happened, but the queen knew pretending could become poison if allowed to spread. So she waited. She let the evening continue. She allowed the music of manners to play on. But somewhere behind the stillness of her expression, a royal response had already begun to take shape. By the time the evening moved toward its final speeches, the queen had already chosen her first move, and it would not happen in public. I want you to write a detailed script based on the outline I provide for a royal and the British monarchy, using a bold, dramatic, and immersive storytelling approach. The script should be structured according to the provided subheading, ensuring that each section builds upon the previous one without abrupt endings or disconnections. The script must maintain a smooth, continuous narrative flow rather than feeling segmented, and follow the words count length mentioned with each outline. Write in a paragraph format. Please keep hook and transition lines same as in outline section tone and style. The script should have a bold, cinematic, and suspenseful tone to keep the audience engaged. The storytelling should be narrative-driven, focusing on mystery, foreshadowing, and emotional highs and lows. Avoid a dry biographical format. The script should feel like an investigative and shocking expose. No visual descriptions, scene instructions, or visual storytelling elements. This should be purely narrative. Use a mix of short and long sentences to control pacing and enhance drama. Engagement techniques that must be used. Cliffhangers and foreshadowing must be incorporated to build suspense. Ensure the script remains emotional and immersive, making the audience feel the struggles, triumphs, and betrayals. No standalone endings in any section. Each section should naturally flow into the next subheading without abrupt conclusions. Use bold and dramatic phrasing to emphasize key moments, struggles, and turning points. Highlight the contrast between success and suffering, making the story compelling. Section breakdown and storytelling approach. Each section must maintain a smooth transition, ensuring a continuous flow of storytelling. The narrative should be engaging, avoiding unnecessary factual overload. Avoid listing events mechanically. Each event must be woven into the broader arc of their journey. The script should not reset at each subheading, but carry the momentum forward, ensuring previous and next subheadings remain connected. Language and accessibility. Use simple language that is accessible to a broad audience. Maintain a storytelling approach, so the script should feel like a dramatic retelling rather than an encyclopedia entry. Avoid formal or academic tones, but the language should feel conversational and immersive. Ensure vivid descriptions through strong word choice rather than relying on visual cues or direct scene instructions. Cues or direct scene instructions. Section number 4. Section heading. A private summons behind palace doors. This section's content. Word count. 440 words. Tone and style. Secretive. Tense, cinematic hook. Before the night ended, one discreet message moved through the palace corridors. No announcement. No raised voice. Just a quiet request that turned Camilla's confidence into unease. Her Majesty wished to speak with her privately, immediately, and without witnesses. Key points: the Queen sends a discreet palace aide to request Camilla's presence away from the glittering reception. Camilla initially assumes it may be a courtesy or routine exchange, but the tone of the summons suggests otherwise. The private room is emotionally cold. No crowd, no charm, no social cover. The Queen does not begin with accusation, she begins with calm observation, making the tension worse. Camilla tries to minimize what happened, perhaps framing it as harmless humor or misunderstanding. The Queen cuts through the excuse by making clear that mockery inside the royal circle is not harmless when it wounds someone already carrying public pressure. The confrontation is restrained but devastating. The Queen reminds Camilla that access to royal spaces is not the same as authority within them. Camilla realizes the Queen saw everything, including the cruelty she thought was hidden. The power dynamic flips. Camilla entered believing Diana was vulnerable, but leaves understanding that the Queen has drawn an invisible boundary around Diana's dignity. Transition line, yet the Queen's warning was only the beginning. Because the real punishment would arrive through protocol, the palace's most elegant form of revenge. Generate a detailed documentary-style script based on the provided outline and subheading. Maintain a bold, dramatic, and engaging storytelling approach with smooth transitions between sections. Avoid word repetition and ensure each section flows naturally into the next. Avoid adding outline headings, just write the script and follow the word's count length, given along with each outline above. In royal life, punishment rarely arrives as scandal. It arrives as a changed chair, a missing invitation, a jewel withheld, a name moved down a list. And the next morning, Camilla discovered the Queen's response had been written into protocol itself. There was no public announcement, no palace statement, no open sign that anything had happened the night before. To anyone outside the gates, the monarchy appeared calm, polished, and untouched. But inside the palace, people understood that the Queen did not need noise to make her meaning clear. She had other tools, older tools, sharper tools, and one of the sharpest was protocol. A future royal arrangement was quietly changed. It was simple on paper. A chair moved, a place adjusted, a name shifted away from the center of attention. But in that world, such changes were never simple. Camilla was not openly punished, yet she was placed farther from influence, farther from warmth, farther from the quiet circle where approval was felt, even when it was never spoken. She still had access, but the access now carried a warning. She could enter the room, but she would not control its meaning. That was the brilliance of it. The change was subtle enough for the palace to deny, but clear enough for every insider to understand. No one needed to be told what it meant. The people who had laughed with Camilla began to step back. Their smiles became safer. Their words became softer. In royal circles, Being close to someone under the Queen's quiet disapproval could become dangerous. Social power could vanish slowly, one invitation at a time. And that was how the room began to shift around Camilla. Diana noticed it, but she did not celebrate. She knew better than to mistake palace protection for pure kindness. The monarchy did not move only because someone was hurt. It moved when hurt became a threat to order. Diana understood that she was being protected, yes, but also managed. Her dignity had been restored, but carefully, in a way that did not make her look weak or publicly wounded. Still, the message mattered. The Queen had taken the insult aimed at Diana and answered it without exposing Diana's pain. She had not turned Diana into a victim before the room. She had not forced her to relive the humiliation. Instead, she used the silent rules of the palace to restore balance. It was cold. It was controlled. But it was powerful. Camilla felt the humiliation in a different way. Not through anger, not through shouting, through exclusion, through distance, through the sudden knowledge that her place was not as secure as she had believed. The same room that had once allowed her confidence now seemed to measure her carefully. The same people who had shared her private amusement now looked away before their loyalty could be questioned. That was the palace's most elegant form of revenge. It did not leave fingerprints. And beneath that quiet punishment, the stakes grew larger. This was no longer only about Diana's dress or Camilla's whisper. It was about how the monarchy fought its private wars, not with open battles, but with seating charts, guest lists, jewels, glances, and silence. A person could be lifted with one gesture and lowered with another. A woman could be protected without being embraced. Another could be warned without being named. But the Queen's move also created a deeper tension. Camilla's resentment did not disappear. It hardened, and Charles, watching the palace choose restraint over indulgence, began to feel the walls closing around him. Because if Camilla had been quietly corrected, then someone else would soon have to answer for why Diana had been left exposed in the first place. But when protocol punished Camilla, it also forced another person into the shadows of the conflict, Charles. Charles had spent years believing the palace would absorb discomfort, smooth over whispers, and protect the future at any cost. But when the Queen called him in, he did not receive comfort. He received a warning that struck deeper than any public scandal. By then, the quiet punishment had already begun to spread through the palace like cold air under a closed door. Camilla had felt it in the changed distance around her. Diana had felt it in the strange return of dignity. But Charles felt something different. He felt pressure, the kind that came not from the public, not from newspapers, not from gossip, but from the one person whose disapproval could still make even a future king feel small. The Queen summoned him separately. That alone told him this was not finished. If the matter had been only about Camilla's behavior, perhaps the warning behind closed doors would have been enough. But the Queen saw a wider problem. Camilla had mocked Diana, yes, but Charles had allowed the atmosphere around Diana to become unsafe. He had allowed coldness to grow. He had allowed people to believe Diana could be wounded quietly, as long as no one made a public scene. Charles may have expected a conversation about appearances. That was how palace problems were often handled. Keep the family calm, keep the public unaware, keep the future protected. But this time, the Queen did not speak only about image. She spoke about dignity. She spoke about restraint. She spoke about consequences. And that made the warning harder to escape. Because the Queen was not asking him who he loved. She was asking what kind of judgment he had shown. That was far more dangerous. Love could be defended. Feelings could be explained. But judgment was different. Judgment belonged to duty. Judgment belonged to the crown. And when the Queen questioned that, Charles had nowhere comfortable to hide. She made it clear that allowing Diana to be mocked did not only weaken Diana. It weakened the monarchy's moral face. Diana may have been emotionally isolated inside the family, but outside the palace, she still carried a power no one could ignore. The public saw her pain. They felt her warmth. They believed in her. And if the palace appeared to let her suffer while others laughed, the damage would not stay behind closed doors. Charles understood the meaning, even if he did not want to accept it. Diana was not just a wounded wife. She was a symbol. She was the soft heart the public still connected to. She was the proof that the royal family could still look human. And that made her suffering dangerous. If she looked abandoned, the crown looked cruel. If she looked humiliated, the palace looked guilty. Charles felt cornered. Part of him resented the idea that he was responsible for Camilla's conduct. Part of him may have wanted to say that Diana was difficult, that the situation was complicated, that no one understood the pressure he carried. But the Queen was not interested in excuses. Personal pain did not erase royal duty. Private desire did not outrank public discipline. That was the line she drew. Charles was trapped between three forces: his loyalty to Camilla, his obligation to Diana, his obedience to the Queen. Each one pulled at him, and none offered peace. Camilla wanted acceptance. Diana deserved respect. The Queen demanded order. And Charles, standing in the middle of it all, began to understand that the palace was no longer willing to quietly absorb every consequence of his choices. The warning did not need to be cruel to hurt. It hurt because it was calm. It hurt because it carried truth. The Queen's patience had limits, and Charles had just been shown where those limits began. He left the meeting shaken, not because his future had been taken from him, but because it had been placed under watch. And somewhere inside that silence, he knew the matter had grown beyond a dress, beyond a laugh, beyond Camilla's pride. The Queen had spoken to him as a son, but also as an heir. And the message was clear. The crown could survive heartbreak, but it could not survive carelessness. But the most unexpected turn was not what the Queen said to Charles, it was what she quietly arranged for Diana. Before sunrise, a velvet box was delivered under palace discretion. No public statement accompanied it. No explanation was offered. But when Diana opened it, she understood something no speech could say. The Queen had answered humiliation with inheritance. The gift arrived quietly, in the careful way palace messages often arrived when they carried more meaning than words. It was not presented before a crowd. It was not wrapped in celebration. It came through trusted hands, with the kind of silence that made it feel heavier than any official announcement. And Diana, still carrying the sting of the night before, knew at once that this was not a simple gesture. Inside was a royal jewel, elegant and old, touched by history. Perhaps pearls, soft but powerful. Perhaps diamonds, cold and bright. Perhaps a brooch passed through royal hands, carrying the weight of women who had survived their own battles behind palace walls. Whatever its exact form, it was clear that this object was not meant only to decorate her. It was meant to speak for the crown. Diana looked at it with mixed emotions. Part of her was moved. Part of her was careful. She had learned not to trust palace kindness too quickly, because kindness in that world often came with rules. Still, the meaning could not be ignored. The Queen had not openly chosen sides. She had not made a speech defending Diana. She had not named Camilla's cruelty before the family. But she had restored balance in the language the monarchy understood best. A jewel. That was the answer. Camilla had mocked Diana's appearance, turning a dress into a target. The Queen answered by placing royal weight back on Diana's shoulders. It was as if the crown itself had whispered, "You are still seen, you are still part of this, and you will not be reduced to someone else's joke." For Diana, the moment cut deeply. Not because it erased the pain, but because it touched the one place she had tried so hard to protect, her need to be valued. She had given the palace beauty, warmth, children, duty, and public love. Yet so often, she felt like an outsider in the very family she had helped make beloved. This jewel did not heal that wound, but it told her she had not been completely abandoned. The palace staff understood too. In royal life, symbolic gifts were never accidental. A necklace, a brooch, a pair of pearls, even the timing of delivery could become a message. And this message had arrived before the sun fully rose, before gossip could settle, before Camilla's laughter could become the final word. Diana kept the jewel close, not as a trophy, but as proof. Proof that silence did not always mean neglect. Proof that the queen had seen more than she said. Proof that dignity, once attacked, could still be returned in a form no one dared question. But gifts inside the monarchy could heal one wound while opening another. Because the moment Diana received that jewel, the balance changed again. Camilla was no longer looking at a woman she believed could be pushed aside. She was looking at someone quietly protected by the highest hand in the palace. And once Camilla heard about the jewel, the private insult became something far more dangerous. A battle over legitimacy. Humiliation can silence some people. But for Camilla, the queen's warning lit a colder fire. Instead of stepping back, she made one more mistake, one whispered complaint too many, and this time, the palace was ready for her. The jewel sent to Diana had changed the meaning of everything. It was quiet, yes, but inside the palace, quiet gestures could thunder louder than public words. Camilla understood what it meant. She understood that Diana had not simply been comforted. She had been marked with royal recognition. The same woman Camilla had tried to belittle had been lifted, not in front of the cameras, but in the secret language of the crown. And that burned. To Camilla, the queen's gift felt like a deliberate slight, a private correction, a reminder that even if Diana looked alone, she was not completely unprotected. Instead of accepting the warning and stepping back, Camilla allowed resentment to speak for her. Behind closed doors, among people she trusted, she complained that Diana was being rewarded for weakness. She suggested Diana knew how to turn pain into power, how to make herself appear wounded, how to make the palace bend around her sadness. But in royal life, there was no such thing as a safe whisper. Words moved. They always did. A complaint shared in confidence became a rumor. A rumor became a report. A report reached ears close to the throne. And when the queen learned that Camilla had not accepted the warning, she did not see it as simple gossip. She saw defiance. Camilla had been corrected once, privately and with restraint. Now she was testing whether that correction had real force behind it. The answer came quietly, but sharply. Camilla's access became more limited. Certain occasions no longer opened as easily. Certain rooms felt farther away. Certain smiles did not return with the same warmth. Nothing was explained, because the palace rarely explained its punishments. That was the cruel genius of it. No one could point to a single public act and call it revenge, yet everyone close enough could feel the door closing inch by inch. Charles saw the situation darkening. He tried to smooth the edges, to calm Camilla, to soften the queen's disapproval, to keep the whole matter from growing into something larger. But his efforts looked weak. He was trying to protect two worlds that no longer trusted each other. One world demanded loyalty, the other demanded order. And between them stood Diana, still composed, still careful, still unaware of every hidden exchange, but aware enough to feel the air changing around her. People treated her differently now. Not openly. Not with sudden affection, but with caution. The palace began guarding her image more closely, not only because Diana deserved dignity, but because the queen understood something dangerous. Public sympathy could become a storm. If Diana looked abandoned, the people would notice. If she looked mocked, they would choose sides. And if the palace looked cruel, even tradition might not be enough to protect it. Camilla's second mistake proved one thing beyond doubt. She had underestimated the monarchy's memory. The crown could move slowly. It could wait. It could smile while arranging consequences in silence. But it did not forget. Yet the final shock was not Camilla's exclusion, it was the Queen's public move that made the entire room understand who had truly won. Days later, at another royal gathering, every eye searched for signs of tension. Would Diana appear wounded? Would Camilla recover her place? Would the Queen pretend nothing happened? Then, with one public gesture, Her Majesty delivered an answer no one could misread. By the time the next royal event arrived, the palace had already changed. Not loudly, not in a way the outside world could easily prove. But inside those polished rooms, everyone could feel it. The air carried a quiet warning. Camilla's place had shifted. Charles had been spoken to. Diana had received a private sign of royal recognition. And the Queen, who had watched the first insult in silence, had not forgotten a single detail. Diana arrived with the same calm grace that had carried her through so many painful moments. But beneath that grace was caution. She knew how quickly a room could turn cold. She knew how smiles could hide judgment. She knew that a woman could be praised in public and left alone in private. So she did not enter expecting rescue. She entered prepared to survive. Camilla watched too. She had already felt the sting of distance, the slow closing of palace doors, the change in how people treated her when the Queen's approval no longer felt certain. But she still hoped the storm had passed. She hoped the palace would return to its old habit of smoothing things over. She hoped Diana's moment of protection would fade into silence. Then the Queen made her move. It was not loud. It did not need to be. She gave Diana a public sign of warmth, a visible act of recognition that turned every private whisper into dust. It may have been a place beside her, a careful compliment, a respectful pause, or a gesture so small that only the palace truly understood it. But the meaning was clear. Diana had not been abandoned. She had not been left to carry the insult alone. And the woman who had been mocked for her dress was now being affirmed by the one person whose approval still ruled the room. The reaction was instant, even if no one dared speak it. Conversation slowed. Eyes shifted. Those who had laughed too easily before became careful. Camilla saw it, and there was no way to soften what it meant. Diana was not being treated like a problem to hide. She was being treated like someone whose dignity still mattered to the crown. For Diana, the moment was powerful because it was not a grand rescue. It was quieter than that, and maybe more painful too. The Queen's gesture did not erase the loneliness, the betrayal, or the years of emotional struggle, but it gave her something she had been denied too often: public respect without pity. Diana did not need to look triumphant. Her strength was in her composure. She had been laughed at, watched, judged, and wounded, yet she still stood with grace. And that was what made the moment unforgettable. Camilla had tried to turn Diana's dress into a weakness, but the Queen had turned it into a test of royal discipline. Charles had been forced to face the cost of silence. The palace had been reminded that cruelty, even when hidden behind manners, could threaten the image of the crown. And Diana, who had entered that first evening as the target of a private joke, now stood as the woman everyone had been forced to recognize. The final shock was not that Camilla was pushed back. It was that the queen made the room understand it, without saying the words. That was the old power of the monarchy. It punished through distance. It rewarded through placement. It spoke through jewels, glances, invitations, and silence. And when it finally chose to act, everyone knew. In the end, one mocking laugh had exposed more than jealousy. It exposed the hidden rules of palace life. It showed how quickly charm could become cruelty, how deeply Diana's pain still mattered, and how carefully the queen could move when she believed the crown itself had been disrespected. Diana's dress began as a target, but by the end, it became the reason the queen reminded the room that even inside the palace, there were lines no one was allowed to cross. And that is why one mocking laugh, one wounded princess, and one silent queen became the palace moment no one dared speak of, but everyone remembered. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this dramatic royal story, make sure to subscribe for more powerful stories from behind palace walls.